The bikers laughed when they saw Clint Eastwood walk into the diner. Just another old actor. They thought. Washed up. Harmless. Then their leader made a fatal mistake. He spilled coffee on Clint's lap and threw the first punch. What those bikers didn't know was that Clint Eastwood isn't just a movie star. He's a real-life karate master. And they were about to learn the hardest lesson of their lives. This is what happened next. The roadside diner sat on the edge of nowhere. A weathered monument to simpler times, where Highway 60 carved through the Arizona desert. Its neon sign flickered against the gathering dusk, casting restless shadows across the dusty parking lot. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of coffee and fried food, punctuated by the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of silverware against ceramic plates. It was the kind of place where folks minded their own business. At least, it used to be. The Desert Scorpions had changed that. They owned the back corner, like it was territory won in war. Their leather vests and road-stained boots marking them as men who took what they wanted. Laughter rolled through the diner. Sharp and mean. The kind that made people look away and pretend they heard nothing. Donna, the waitress who had worked here for 20 years, kept her head down as she refilled coffee cups. She knew better than to make eye contact when the Scorpions were in town. Tonight, they were restless. A younger waitress, barely 20, stood frozen near their table, her hands gripping a coffee pot like it might anchor her to safety. One of the bikers tapped his dirty boot against the floor, his grin spreading wide. "Come on, sweetheart," he drawled. "Ain't polite to serve a man without a smile." The girl shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the kitchen, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Vance, the leader, leaned back in his chair. He was a big man, all shoulders and swagger, with a face that had seen its share of fights and won most of them. His voice cut through the noise, rough as gravel. "Maybe she thinks she's too good for us." The gang erupted in laughter, thick with beer and bad intentions. The girl took a step back, but Vance was quicker. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but enough to show her she wasn't walking away without permission. That was when the door opened. A gust of hot wind swept through the diner, rattling the sugar jars on the counter. The chatter slowed. Heads turned. Clint Eastwood stepped inside. He moved the way a storm does before it breaks. Calm. Deliberate. Inevitable. The years had carved lines into his face, but they hadn't softened him. If anything, they made him look harder, like granite shaped by wind and time. He wore a denim shirt tucked into worn jeans, a leather belt with a simple buckle, and boots that had walked more miles than most men ever would. A weathered Stetson sat low on his brow, shading eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. He pulled off the hat, dusted it once against his leg, and set it on the counter as he took a seat in the farthest booth. His movements were economical, without hurry or hesitation. A whisper ran through the room. Someone muttered, "Is that Clint Eastwood?" Vance's grin faltered. One of his crew, a wiry man with tattoos creeping up his neck, shifted in his seat. "Hell," he muttered under his breath. But Vance wasn't the kind to back down. Not in front of his boys. Not in front of a room full of nobodies. He pushed his chair back, the wooden legs screeching against the tile, and stood. "Well? Well?" he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at that. A damn movie star in our humble little diner." Clint didn't move, didn't look up. He reached for the menu. flipping it open like he had all the time in the world. Vance strolled over, beer bottle dangling from his fingers, boots heavy on the floor. "You're Clint Eastwood, ain't you?" The silence stretched. Clint turned a page, studying the menu like it held answers to questions no one had asked. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured. "Last time I checked." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the diner. The young waitress broke free from the biker's grip and hurried to the kitchen, relief plain on her face. Vance either didn't notice or didn't care. "You mind if I sit?" Vance asked. Though it wasn't a question, Clint turned another page. "I mind." The air thickened, the kind of silence that made people sweat. Vance's jaw worked, his grip tightening on the beer bottle. He'd been dismissed, and everyone saw it. "Now hold on," Vance said, pulling out the seat across from Clint anyway. "Ain't every day we get a celebrity in town. Maybe we ought to get to know each other." Clint finally set the menu down. His eyes lifted, calm and steady. Unimpressed. "I eat alone." A pause. Then Vance's grin returned. But now there was something uglier behind it. "You think you're too good for company?" His voice dropped, laced with threat. "Or just too good for us?" Clint didn't answer. He reached for his coffee, took a slow sip. And that was what did it. The complete and utter lack of fear. Vance had built his reputation on fear, on the way folks flinched when he raised his voice, on how men backed down when he stepped too close. But this man wouldn't even look up from his coffee. The bikers snickered, watching their leader get brushed off like dust on a boot. "Get a look at this," one of them said. "Clint Eastwood don't want to play." Another chimed in, smirking. Maybe he left his tough guy act in Hollywood. Laughter rippled through the gang, forced and hollow. Clint set his cup down with deliberate care. Donna froze behind the counter. She'd worked here long enough to know what came next. Vance leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You know, Eastwood," he said, voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I heard all them gunfights in your movies are fake. Ain't no real fighting in Hollywood." "Is there?" Clint breathed out slowly through his nose. One long day behind him, one long drive ahead, and all he wanted was a quiet meal. But some men didn't know when to walk away. "You ever been in a real fight?" "Old man," Vance pressed. "Or is all that just camera tricks?" The diner held its breath. Clint leaned back, finally meeting Vance's eyes. A silence settled over the room, thick as desert heat. Vance swallowed. "Just once." "Son," Clint said, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "You got two choices." Vance blinked. Clint nodded toward the front door. "You walk out of here," he said, tapping the table with two fingers. "Or you get carried out." The words landed like stones in still water. The diner held its breath. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to quiet itself. Vance's face darkened. He couldn't back down now, not in front of them. His fingers tightened around the beer bottle, knuckles going white. "Is that right?" he sneered. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached forward and tipped Clint's coffee over. The liquid spilled across the table, dripping onto Clint's lap. "Oops," Vance said, feigning innocence. "Guess you're not quick enough to stop that." "Who?" A hush fell over the room. The bikers stared, waiting for what came next. Clint hid. Slowly, he took a napkin and dabbed at his jeans. No rush, no sudden movements. But something had changed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Vance's smirk twitched. He hadn't gotten the reaction he wanted, and that irritated him. "What's the matter? Old-timer?" he pressed. Leaning in close, the sharp bite of whiskey and cigarettes was thick on his breath. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe I ought to teach you some manners." Clint lifted his gaze. Those cold blue eyes locked onto Vance's, and a weight settled over the room like a storm rolling in from the desert. There was no anger in his expression, no fear, just that quiet, steady intensity that made a man question everything he thought he knew. "You ought to clean that up," Clint said, voice low and even, less a suggestion, more a certainty. Vance blinked, thrown for just a fraction of a second. Then he let out a sharp, barking laugh and turned toward his gang, throwing his arms out wide like this was some big joke. "You hear that?" he crowed. "He wants me to clean it up." His boys laughed along, but it wasn't the same. Their chuckles felt forced now, lacking the confidence from before. Something about Clint sitting there, untouched by Vance's posturing, had taken the fun out of it. Vance turned back, his grin thinning into something uglier. "You got some nerve, old man," he growled, his voice dropping an octave. "Maybe I ought to knock some of that tough guy act right out of you." He cracked his knuckles. The sound echoed through the silent diner. Clint didn't move, didn't flinch. He just leaned back slightly, hands resting loosely on the table, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to do that," he said, calm as a man, talking about the weather. Vance's jaw tightened. He straightened, puffing up his chest, unwilling to lose face. Behind him, his crew stirred, ready to back him up if things went south. Donna took a hesitant step forward, her voice thin with nerves. "Vance, don't. Just let it go." But Vance wasn't listening. He never did. "What's it going to be? Grandpa?" he sneered, his breath coming faster now. "You scared yet?" A faint flicker of something crossed Clint's face. It wasn't amusement. It was something colder. "Scared?" Clint echoed, his voice just above a whisper. Not even a little. The diner held its breath. The air crackled, thick with unspoken tension. For the first time that night, Vance hesitated. It was small, barely a pause. But it was there. A flicker of doubt crossing his face. A sliver of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he had picked the wrong fight. But pride was a hell of a thing. Vance leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "Then let's see what you got." Old man. The stage was set. What had been a quiet diner filled with warmth and familiarity now felt like a loaded gun, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. Vance saw an aging actor, past his prime. Clint knew better. The years might have carved lines into his face, but they hadn't dulled the instincts. The kind you don't lose, no matter how long you've been out of the fight. The tension in the diner had wound itself tight, a coil ready to snap. Vance stood there, fists clenched, his breath coming harder now. His crew watched, waiting. The other patrons had already begun to edge toward the exits, sensing what was coming. Clint remained seated, his posture loose but ready. He wasn't looking for this fight, but he wasn't going to avoid it either. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. Vance made his move. With a roar meant more for his gang than for intimidation. He lunged forward and threw a wild haymaker aimed straight at Clint's jaw. It was the kind of punch meant to end things quickly, to make a statement in front of everyone watching. But the fist never connected. In the space of a heartbeat, Clint moved. One clean, effortless shift to the side, and Vance's punch cut through empty air. The sudden miss sent him stumbling forward, his own momentum betraying him. Before he could recover, Clint's hand shot out, catching Vance's wrist in an iron grip. The move was surgical, precise. Clint twisted the arm at an unforgiving angle, and Vance's knees buckled beneath him. Pain shot up through his shoulder as he dropped hard onto the tiled floor. The sharp crack of bone against linoleum echoed through the stunned silence. Clint barely looked fazed. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "First rule," he said quietly. "Don't telegraph your punches." Vance's face contorted. Caught somewhere between agony and disbelief, he jerked against the hold, trying to free himself. But Clint's grip was locked tight, unyielding. Chairs scraped violently across the floor as the rest of the gang sprang to their feet. The moment of shocked silence shattered like glass. "Let him go!" one of them barked, his voice laced with forced bravado. A switchblade flashed open with a sharp click. The dim glow from the overhead lights caught on the blade's edge, a sliver of silver in the haze. Donna ducked behind the counter, fumbling for the phone, her hands shaking. Clint didn't blink. With deliberate ease, he released Vance's wrist and drove his elbow straight into the man's face. The sickening crack of cartilage rang out. Blood poured from Vance's nose as he reeled backward, hands flying to his face. His body hit the floor in a graceless heap. Clint rose from his seat, turning to face the rest of them. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He stood just slightly taller than most of them, his presence filling the room like a shadow stretching long at dusk. The man with the knife lunged, his attack wild and desperate. Clint sidestepped smoothly, his hand snapping out like a viper to seize the attacker's wrist. He twisted hard, and the biker yelped, fingers loosening instantly. The knife clattered to the floor with a metallic ring. In the same fluid motion, Clint drove his knee deep into the man's gut. The air left his lungs in a strangled gasp, and he crumpled to the ground, wheezing. "Second rule," Clint said, his tone steady. "Don't bring a weapon you don't know how to use." Two more came at him at once, hoping numbers would make the difference. One swung a heavy chain. The other aimed a kick at Clint's legs. But Clint moved like water, flowing between their attacks. He ducked beneath the chain as it whipped past his head, then caught the kicker's ankle mid-strike. With a sharp twist, the man lost his balance. Clint swept his other leg out from under him, sending him crashing into a nearby table. Plates and glasses exploded on impact, shards scattering across the floor. The one with the chain recovered and swung again, but Clint was already inside his reach. A precise strike to the elbow sent the chain flying. Before the biker could react, Clint's palm drove into his chest with brutal efficiency. The man staggered backward, gasping, and collapsed into a booth. Another biker charged from the side, trying to tackle Clint from behind. Clint sensed it before he saw it. It pivoted smoothly, caught the man's arm, and used his own momentum against him. With a sharp pull and a twist, the biker found himself airborne for just a moment before gravity brought him down hard onto the linoleum. The diner had descended into chaos. Tables overturned, coffee cups shattered, chairs scattered in every direction. The patrons who hadn't fled pressed themselves against the walls, watching in silent awe as Clint dismantled the gang with methodical precision. Donna, still behind the counter, had managed to grab the phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, ready to dial. But then she looked at Clint, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Respect, maybe. Or disbelief. Clint caught her gaze and gave a slight shake of his head. "Won't need them," he said quietly. One more biker, heavier than the rest, charged with a wooden bat raised high. He swung with everything he had, aiming for Clint's head. Clint leaned back just enough for the bat to miss by inches. The force of the swing left the man off balance. Clint struck. A spinning kick, clean and devastating, caught the biker in the ribs. The bat flew from his hands, clattering across the floor. The man doubled over, clutching his side, and dropped to his knees. Now the diner fell silent except for the groans of the fallen. Vance, still on the floor, blood dripping from his shattered nose, stared up at Clint with something approaching terror. His swagger was gone, replaced by the raw understanding that he had misjudged everything. The remaining gang members, those still standing, exchanged nervous glances. Their confidence had evaporated. This wasn't some washed-up actor playing tough. This was something else entirely. Vance struggled to his feet, using a chair for support, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. But beneath it all was fear. Real fear. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice thick and muffled by the blood in his mouth. "You hear me? Old man, this ain't over." Clint looked at him for a long moment. No anger, no pity. Just that steady, unshakable gaze. "It is if you're smart," Clint said. His voice was low, carrying a weight that left no room for argument. "Walk away. Learn something. Or come back and lose again." Vance opened his mouth, maybe to fire back one more threat. But nothing came out. The reality of the situation had finally settled in. He'd brought his entire crew into a fight they couldn't win. With a grunt of pain and frustration, Vance turned and limped toward the door. One by one, his gang followed, some clutching their ribs, others nursing bruised egos and battered pride. They didn't look back. The door swung shut behind them, and the roar of motorcycle engines filled the night. Within moments, the sound faded into the distance, swallowed by the desert. Clint stood there for a moment, breathing steady, his expression unchanged. Then, as if nothing had happened, he straightened his shirt, picked up his hat from the counter, and placed it back on his head. The diner remained frozen, every eye locked on him. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. An older man near the back, weathered and gray, his hands rough from years of work. Others joined in, hesitant at first, then more certain. Applause rippled through the room. Clint didn't acknowledge it. He simply walked back to his booth, picked up the menu, and sat down. Donna emerged from behind the counter, still clutching a towel in her trembling hands. She approached slowly, cautiously, as if afraid he might vanish if she moved too quickly. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice shaking. "Those men have been terrorizing this place for months. No one's ever stood up to them like that." Clint glanced up at her, his expression softening just slightly. "They needed reminding," he said simply. "Can I get you anything?" "On the house." "Of course. Just the steak I ordered," Clint replied. "Medium rare." Donna smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Coming right up." As she walked back to the kitchen, the other patrons began to settle back into their seats. Conversations resumed. Tentative at first, then more animated. The tension that had gripped the diner for so long had finally lifted. Clint ate in silence, savoring each bite. The steak was better than he expected. When he finished, he left cash on the table, more than enough to cover the meal and the damage. Donna caught him at the door. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Really?" Clint tipped his hat. Just passing through. He stepped out into the night, the cool desert air washing over him. The sky was clear. Stars scattered across the darkness like broken glass. He climbed into his truck, an old Ford that had seen better days but still ran strong, and started the engine. As he pulled onto the highway, his thoughts drifted. Men like Vance were everywhere. Loud, angry, desperate to prove something. Most of them learned eventually. Some never did. Clint knew this wasn't finished. Pride was a powerful thing, and wounded pride was dangerous. Vance would lick his wounds, gather his courage, and come looking for another round. It was only a matter of time. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Clint had done what needed doing, and that was enough. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as he drove, the road stretching endlessly ahead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry swallowed by the vastness of the desert. The Desert Rose Motel sat 20 miles outside of town, a relic from a time when travelers still took the scenic route. The neon sign out front flickered erratically, casting restless shadows across the cracked parking lot. Only 3 cars sat beneath the dim glow, Clint's old Ford among them. Room 12 was sparse, a bed with sheets that had seen too many washes, a wooden desk scarred with cigarette burns from decades past, a single window that looked out onto nothing but darkness and desert. It was perfect. Clint sat at the desk, a glass of whiskey in one hand. The amber liquid caught the light from the bedside lamp, casting warm reflections on the worn surface. He wasn't drinking to forget. He was drinking to remember. In his other hand, he held a photograph. The edges were worn smooth from years of handling, the colors faded but still visible. It showed a younger version of himself, maybe 35, standing in a dojo wearing a white gi. His stance was perfect, his expression focused. Around him stood other men in similar attire, all serious, all disciplined. Those had been different days. Days when control and precision weren't just skills but a way of life. He'd earned his black belt in karate through sweat and discipline, competing in tournaments across California and Nevada. Fighting wasn't about anger then. It was about respect, honor, and understanding your own capabilities. He took a slow sip of whiskey, feeling the burn slide down his throat. The fight at the diner hadn't been about showing off or proving anything. It had been about necessity. Men like Vance didn't understand words. They understood consequences. Clint set the photograph down carefully, his fingers lingering on the edge. He knew what came next. Pride didn't heal overnight, and humiliation festered like an infected wound. Vance would come back. They always did. The question wasn't if, it was when. He rose from the desk and walked to the window, pulling back the thin curtain. The desert stretched endlessly beneath a canopy of stars. Somewhere out there, Vance was nursing his wounds and plotting revenge. Clint could feel it the way a man feels rain coming before the first drop falls. He finished his whiskey and set the glass down. Whatever was coming, he'd be ready. Across town, in a dimly lit garage that smelled of oil and old leather, the desert scorpions were licking their wounds. The space was cluttered with motorcycle parts, tools, and beer bottles. A single fluorescent light hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that made the men look harder than they were. Vance paced like a caged animal, his face swollen and discolored. A crude bandage covered his broken nose, spotted with dried blood. His movements were jerky, fueled by rage and humiliation that had nowhere to go. "That old bastard made fools of us," he roared, slamming his fist into a nearby workbench. The impact sent a wrench clattering to the concrete floor. "You got any idea what people are gonna say when they hear about this?" His crew sat in various states of injury. One held an ice pack to his ribs. Another nursed a split lip. They exchanged glances but said nothing. What could they say? They'd all seen what happened. Jesse, the youngest of the group at 23, sat apart from the others. He was lean, with nervous energy that made him seem even younger. Unlike the rest, his face showed more thought than anger. "Maybe we should just let it go," JC said quietly. His voice carried hesitation but also conviction. "That man, he ain't normal. Vance. We all saw what he did." Vance spun to face him, eyes blazing. "What did you say?" Jesse swallowed but held his ground. "I'm saying maybe we bit off more than we can chew. That wasn't some lucky old man throwing punches. That was training. Real training." "So what?" Vance spat. "You want us to tuck tail and run? You want people thinking the Desert Scorpions are scared of some washed-up actor? I want us to think smart." Jesse replied, "There's a difference between being tough and being stupid." The other gang members shifted uncomfortably. A few nodded almost imperceptibly. Jesse had spoken what some of them were thinking, but were too afraid to say. Vance's face darkened. He stalked toward Jesse, his bulk intimidating in the confined space. "You calling me stupid?" Jesse stood his ground, though his hands betrayed his nerves. "I'm saying that man is dangerous, and going after him again might end worse than it did tonight." For a moment, it looked like Vance might throw a punch. His fists clenched. His jaw worked. But then, he turned away, breathing hard through his mouth. "Nobody makes me look weak," he said, his voice dropping to something cold and deliberate. "Nobody. I don't care if he's Clint Eastwood or the damn president. We're gonna finish this." One of the older members, a stocky man named Crawford with a graying beard, spoke up. "How you planning to do that?" "Vance, we just got our asses handed to us. What makes you think round two's gonna be different?" Vance turned back to face them. And now there was something calculating in his expression. The rage was still there, but it had focused into something sharper. "Because this time, we're bringing insurance," he said. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "I got a buddy in Phoenix. Runs with a crew that handles problems for money. Real professionals. Not like us." He looked around the garage. "No offense." Crawford frowned. "You talking about hiring muscle? 5 guys." Vance said, "Experienced. They don't ask questions and they get the job done. We bring them in. We bring the right equipment. And we make sure that old man understands he picked the wrong people to mess with." Jesse shook his head. "This is crazy." "Vance, you're talking about escalating this into something way bigger than it needs to be." "It's already big," Vance shouted, his composure cracking again. "He put his hands on me, in front of everyone. You think I can just walk away from that?" The garage fell silent. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. Finally, Crawford spoke. "What kind of equipment we talking about?" Vance's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Batons. Chains. Maybe some rubber bullets. Nothing that'll kill him, but enough to make sure he remembers us for the rest of his life. Jesse stood abruptly. I'm out. All eyes turned to him. You're what? Vance said, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm out, Jesse repeated, meeting his gaze. I didn't sign up for this. We're bikers. Vance. We ride. We drink. We have a good time. We ain't hitmen. And we ain't going after some old man with hired thugs because your pride got hurt. Vance took a step toward him. You walk out that door. You're done. You hear me? You don't come back. Jesse nodded slowly. Yeah, I hear you. He turned and walked toward the garage door. No one stopped him. The sound of his boots on concrete echoed until he pushed through the door and disappeared into the night. The remaining gang members watched him go. A few looked like they wanted to follow, but none did. Vance turned back to the others. Anyone else want to leave? Silence. Good. Vance said, Now here's what we're gonna do. The next morning, Clint was sitting on the small porch outside his motel room, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the desert. The sky had turned shades of orange and pink, painting the landscape in colors that made the harsh terrain look almost beautiful. His phone rang. The number was local, but unfamiliar. He answered. Mr. Eastwood. It was Donna's voice, tight with worry. Morning, Clint said. I'm sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. I just heard from my nephew who works at the auto shop in town. Vance has been making calls. He's bringing in people from Phoenix. Rough people. Clint took a sip of his coffee. I figured. You figured? Donna's voice rose slightly. Mr. Eastwood. These aren't just bikers. He's hiring professionals. You need to leave town. Get somewhere safe. Appreciate the warning. Clint said calmly. But running isn't in my nature. There was a pause on the other end. Then Donna spoke again, her voice softer. You already knew they'd come back. Didn't you? Men like that always do. What are you going to do? Clint looked out at the desert. The vast emptiness that had stood unchanged for thousands of years. What needs doing? Be careful. Donna said, Please. Always am. He ended the call and set the phone down on the plastic chair beside him. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he finished it anyway. In the distance, heat waves were already beginning to shimmer off the asphalt. Clint stood and walked back into his room. From his duffel bag, he pulled out a worn leather jacket and slipped it on. Then he checked his boots, making sure the laces were tied tight. He moved through these preparations with the same calm he'd shown at the diner. No rush, no panic, just readiness. He thought about calling the sheriff. But what would he say? That he expected trouble based on a feeling? That wouldn't get him far. Besides, involving the law would complicate things. This was between him and Vance. It needed to stay that way. As the sun climbed higher, Clint sat back down on the porch. He pulled out the old photograph again, studying the faces of the men he'd trained with all those years ago. Most of them were probably retired now, living quiet lives, teaching, maybe, or running dojos of their own. He'd taken a different path. Acting had given him a life he'd never imagined, but it hadn't changed who he was underneath. The discipline remained, the training remained, and when pushed, the fighter remained. The day wore on. Clint didn't move from his spot except to refill his coffee. He watched cars pass on the distant highway. their reflections distorted by the heat. He watched lizards scurry across the parking lot, hunting for shade. He watched, and he waited. Evening came slowly, the sun dropping toward the horizon like a stone sinking through honey. The temperature began to fall, and with it came that peculiar desert quiet when even the wind seems to hold its breath. That's when he heard them. At first, it was just a low rumble, distant and indistinct. But it grew steadily louder, resolving into the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines. Not just a few, many. Clint stood slowly, his hand resting on the porch railing. His expression didn't change. No fear, no anger, just that same steady calm that had defined him his entire life. The sound grew closer. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the gathering dusk. 1, then 2, then 5, then more. They came down the access road like a pack of wolves, engines snarling. Clint stepped off the porch and walked toward the center of the parking lot. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. He stood there, hands loose at his sides, and watched them come. The motorcycles roared into the motel lot, circling once before, forming a loose semicircle around him. Dust kicked up in their wake, swirling in the headlight beams. The engines cut off one by one, leaving behind a ringing silence. Men dismounted, more than had been at the diner. Twice as many, at least. Some he recognized from before. Others were new faces. Harder faces. These were the ones from Phoenix. Vance stepped forward, his face still swollen but his eyes burning with purpose. In his hand, he held a steel baton. "Didn't think you'd still be here?" Vance called out. Clint said nothing. He just watched. "Thought maybe you'd gotten smart and run." Vance continued, moving closer. "But I guess old dogs really can't learn new tricks." The hired men spread out, flanking Clint from both sides. They moved with practiced coordination. Professionals who'd done this before. Each carried something. Batons. Chains. One had what looked like a paintball gun, modified to fire rubber bullets. Clint's gaze swept over them, taking inventory, calculating. His expression remained unchanged. "Last time, you caught us off guard," Vance said. "This time's different. This time, you're gonna learn what happens when you embarrass the wrong people." Clint finally spoke, his voice carrying across the parking lot, despite its quietness. "Last chance to walk away." Vance laughed, but it was hollow. "You serious? Look around." "Old man, you think you're walking out of this?" Clint's eyes met his. Cold, steady, unwavering. "Let them come," he said. The first man came fast, swinging a steel baton in a wide arc aimed at Clint's head. He was one of the professionals from Phoenix. His movements practiced and efficient, but practice wasn't the same as real combat. Clint ducked beneath the swing, his body moving with fluid precision. As the baton whooshed past, he stepped inside the man's guard and drove his palm into the attacker's solar plexus. The impact was surgical. The man's breath left him in a sharp gasp, and his knees buckled. He went down hard. Two more rushed in from opposite sides, trying to flank him. One wielded a heavy chain, the other a baton. They came in coordinated, clearly having worked together before. Clint pivoted, angling his body so both attackers were in his line of sight. The one with the chain struck first, whipping it toward Clint's legs. Clint jumped, the chain passing beneath his boots, then landed and immediately spun. His foot caught the chain wielder in the ribs with a sharp crack. The man stumbled sideways, gasping. The second attacker lunged with the baton, aiming for Clint's shoulder. Clint blocked with his forearm. The impact, sending a jolt up his arm. He felt that one. These men hit harder than Vance's crew. But pain was just information. Clint grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it outward, and drove his elbow into the attacker's jaw. The man's eyes glazed, and he dropped like a stone. 3 down, 9 to go. The remaining attackers hesitated, reassessing. This wasn't going how Vance had promised. One of them raised the modified paintball gun, aiming at Clint's chest. "Wait!" Vance shouted. But it was too late. The rubber bullet fired with a sharp crack. Clint shifted, but not fast enough. It caught him in the shoulder. The impact, like being punched by a heavyweight. He grunted, feeling the bruise already forming, but didn't go down. His eyes found the shooter. The man's confidence faltered under that cold stare. Before anyone could react, Clint closed the distance. 6 quick strides, and he was on the gunman. He swept the weapon aside with one hand and drove his fist into the man's gut with the other. The shooter doubled over, and Clint finished him with a knee to the face. 4 down. Now they all came at once. It was chaos. Fists, batons, chains. They surrounded him, attacking from every angle. Clint moved like he was 20 years younger, his training overriding the years. Block, strike, pivot, counter. Each movement economical. Nothing wasted. A baton came at his head. He ducked and drove his knuckles into the attacker's kidney. The man cried out and fell away. A chain wrapped around his forearm. Clint yanked hard, pulling the wielder off balance. Then struck with his free hand. The chain fell loose. Another attacker grabbed him from behind, trying to lock his arms. Clint dropped his weight, slipped the hold, and drove his elbow backward into the man's ribs. He heard something crack. The arms released, but the numbers were taking their toll. A fist caught Clint in the side. Another glanced off his jaw. He tasted copper, blood. His breathing came harder now. His movements still precise, but requiring more effort. A professional from Phoenix, bigger than the others, charged like a bull. Clint couldn't sidestep in time. The man's shoulder drove into his chest, and they both went down, tumbling across the gravel. Pain shot through Clint's back as stones dug into his spine. The big man tried to pin him, throwing punches. Clint blocked 2, took one to the cheek, then found an opening. His thumb drove into a pressure point at the base of the man's neck. The attacker's eyes went wide as his arm went temporarily numb. Clint shoved him off and rolled to his feet. 7 down. 5 left standing. Plus Vance. The remaining attackers circled more cautiously now. They'd watched half their number fall, and the old man was still standing, bloodied. Yes. Breathing hard. Yes. But standing. That's when Jesse appeared at the edge of the parking lot. He'd been watching from the shadows, having followed the gang despite leaving them hours earlier. He couldn't shake the feeling that this would end badly. Now, seeing Clint surrounded and injured, something in him stirred. "Stop!" Jesse shouted, running forward. Everyone froze. Turning to look at him, Vance's face twisted with fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jesse ignored him, his eyes on the remaining attackers. "This is wrong. Can't you see that? We're 12 against 1, and he's still standing. This ain't about pride anymore. This is just cruelty. One of the Phoenix men laughed. Kid, get lost before you get hurt. Jesse stood his ground, but he didn't move toward Clint. He just stood there, a silent objection to what was happening. Clint's eyes found Jesse's. For a brief moment, recognition passed between them. The young man who'd had the sense to walk away. "You're young," Clint said, his voice carrying despite the exertion. "Don't waste your life following fools." Jesse nodded slowly, his jaw tight. The remaining attackers rushed Clint again, apparently deciding words were done. But something had shifted. The hesitation, the doubt Jesse had voiced, had planted itself in their minds. Clint met them head on. A spinning kick caught one in the chest, sending him crashing into a parked motorcycle. It toppled with a metallic crash. Another attacker swung a baton. Clint caught it mid-swing, wrenched it from the man's grip, and used it to sweep his legs. The man went down hard. Two of the Phoenix professionals remained, plus Vance. The professionals exchanged a glance, then looked at Vance. "This ain't what we signed up for." One said, "You said it'd be easy money." "Don't you dare walk away," Vance screamed. But they did. Both men turned and headed for their motorcycles. They'd been paid for a quick intimidation job, not a prolonged battle with someone who fought like a trained killer. Now it was just Vance. The parking lot had gone silent, except for the groans of the fallen and the ragged breathing of the two men still standing. Jesse remained at the edge, watching, waiting. Vance picked up the steel baton he'd dropped earlier. His hands shook, though whether from rage or fear was unclear. His face, already swollen from the diner fight, had taken on a desperate quality. "You think you've won?" Vance spat. "You think this is over?" Clint straightened, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "It's over when you say it is?" "Never," Vance charged. The baton raised high. He was wild now, all technique abandoned in favor of pure desperation. He swung hard, aiming to crush Clint's skull. But rage made men predictable. Clint sidestepped, caught Vance's wrist, and twisted. The baton fell from nerveless fingers. Before Vance could react, Clint swept his legs and drove him face first into the gravel. In one fluid motion, Clint pinned Vance's arm behind his back, applying pressure to the shoulder joint. Not enough to dislocate, but enough to immobilize completely. Vance struggled, gasping, trying to break free. But the hold was absolute. "You had a choice," Clint said quietly, his voice carrying in the stillness. "Every man does. You chose wrong." Vance's struggling slowed. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by something raw and broken. "Strength isn't about how many men you hurt," Clint continued. "It's about protecting what matters, about knowing when to stand and when to walk away. You never learned that." For the first time, Vance's voice cracked. "You humiliated me?" "No," Clint said. "You humiliated yourself." "I just defended myself and others. You were terrorizing." "There's a difference." Clint released the hold and stood, stepping back. Vance remained on the ground, his face pressed into the gravel. His shoulders began to shake. Whether from rage or something else was hard to tell. But when he finally lifted his head, his eyes were wet. "What happens now?" Vance asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The distant wail of sirens answered the question. Clint looked up, seeing the flashing red and blue lights approaching down the highway. Donna had made the call after all. Jesse stepped forward, Mr. Eastwood, you should go. Clint met his eyes. You sure? I'll tell them what happened. The truth. That you defended yourself. Jesse glanced at Vance, still on the ground. That we came here looking for trouble and found it. The sirens grew louder. Clint walked to his truck. Each step measured, despite the pain in his ribs and back. He climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot just as 3 sheriff's vehicles turned in. In his rearview mirror, he saw Jesse helping Vance to his feet as deputies emerged from their cars. The young man was already talking, his hands gesturing, explaining. Clint drove until the motel disappeared behind a curve in the road, then pulled over. He sat there for a moment, breathing through the pain, checking his injuries in the rearview mirror. A split lip, bruised cheek. His shoulder where the rubber bullet hit would be purple by morning. But he'd walk away. They wouldn't. He pulled back onto the highway, heading west into the gathering darkness. Behind him, Jesse stood in the glare of police lights, watching the taillights fade, thinking about the words an old man had spoken, words that might have just changed his life. The sheriff's deputies moved through the parking lot with practiced efficiency, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, one by one. They rounded up the fallen bikers and the hired men from Phoenix. Handcuffs clicked. Miranda rights were read. The wounded were checked for serious injuries before being loaded into squad cars and an ambulance that had arrived shortly after the police. Vance sat on the hood of a patrol car, his hands cuffed behind his back. A deputy had cleaned the blood from his face, revealing the full extent of the damage. His nose, already broken from the diner fight, had swollen to twice its normal size. His eyes carried a hollow, distant look, like a man staring into a future he'd never imagined for himself. Sheriff Marcus Reeves, a weathered man in his late 50s with a reputation for fairness, stood before Vance. He'd known the Desert Scorpions were trouble, had warned them more than once to keep their activities in check. Now they'd crossed a line there was no coming back from. Assault with deadly weapons, conspiracy, attempted grievous bodily harm. Reeves listed, his tone matter of fact, and that's just for starters. You brought hired thugs across state lines to attack a man. That's federal. Vance, you understand what that means? Vance said nothing. He just stared at the ground. Where'd Eastwood go? Reeves asked Jesse, who stood nearby giving his statement to another deputy. He left before you arrived. Sir, Jesse said, drove west on the highway. You gonna tell me what happened here? Reeves pressed. Jesse took a breath. We came looking for trouble. Mr. Eastwood was just defending himself. Everything that happened, we brought on ourselves. Reeves studied the young man for a long moment. That's a mighty honest answer. It's the truth. The sheriff turned back to Vance. You got anything to say for yourself? For the first time, Vance looked up. His voice came out rough, broken. I was wrong. Reeves raised an eyebrow. In all his years dealing with the Desert Scorpions, he'd never heard Vance admit fault for anything. I thought I was tough. Vance continued, the words seeming to cost him something. Thought having a crew and instilling fear made me somebody. But that man... He trailed off, shaking his head. That man showed me what real strength looks like. And it ain't this. Little late for revelations, Reeves said, though not unkindly. You're looking at serious time. Vance nodded slowly. I know. As the deputies loaded him into the back of a patrol car, Vance's eyes drifted to the highway where Clint's taillights had disappeared. Something fundamental had broken inside him during that fight. Not his body, though that had taken damage, but his sense of who he was, what he'd built his identity on. It had all been exposed as hollow. For the first time in his life, Vance felt something he'd spent years making others feel. Genuine shame. The patrol car pulled away, heading toward the county jail. In the back seat, Vance closed his eyes and wondered if he'd ever be able to rebuild himself into something better. The thought terrified him more than any prison sentence could. Jesse watched the vehicles depart, then turned to find his motorcycle. But Reeves stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "You're not under arrest," the sheriff said. "Your statement checks out, and the motel security camera caught most of it. But let me give you some advice. Son, the company you keep defines you more than you think. Choose better." "Yes, sir," Jesse said quietly. "I intend to." 3 days later, Jesse pushed open the door to the roadside diner. The place looked different in daylight, less threatening without the scorpions occupying the back corner. A few locals looked up as he entered, their expressions wary. Donna was behind the counter, pouring coffee for an elderly couple. When she saw Jesse, her hand paused mid-pour. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something harder. "We don't want trouble here," she said, her voice firm. Jesse held up his hands. "I'm not here to cause any. I need to say something." The diner had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. "I'm sorry," JC said, the words coming out rushed but sincere. "For everything. For what Vance and the others did. For the way we made people feel afraid in their own town. For not standing up sooner." He swallowed hard. "I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know I mean it." Donna studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she set down the coffee pot. "You're the one who talked to the sheriff, who told the truth about what happened." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Jesse thought about Clint's words, about choices. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I'm tired of being the kind of person who does wrong things." The elderly man at the counter spoke up, his voice gravelly with age. "Takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Son, not many got that." Donna wiped her hands on her apron. "What are you going to do now?" "I'm looking for work," JC said. "Left the Scorpions. Left that whole life behind. I'm not much good at anything besides fixing bikes. But I'm willing to learn." Donna considered this. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a napkin, writing something on it with a pen. She slid it across to Jesse. "My brother runs an auto repair shop over in Cottonwood Springs, 20 miles east. He's always looking for good mechanics who show up on time and work honest. You tell him I sent you." Jesse stared at the napkin like it was something precious. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just prove you meant what you said about changing." "I will," Jesse promised. "Thank you." "Ma'am, really." As he turned to leave, Donna called after him. "Jesse?" He looked back. "That man, Mr. Eastwood. He saw something in you worth saving. Don't prove him wrong." Jesse nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. He walked out into the bright Arizona sun, the napkin clutched in his hand, feeling like he'd just been given a second chance he didn't deserve but would fight to earn. 200 miles west. Clint drove through the desert night. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. His ribs ached. His shoulder throbbed where the rubber bullet had struck. But he'd felt worse. He thought about Vance. about the look in the man's eyes when the fight had ended. That moment when bravado crumbled and reality crashed in. Clint had seen that look before. In other men, other fights. Some learned from it. Some didn't. He thought about Jesse, the young man who'd found his courage at the right moment, who'd chosen to stand apart rather than stand with cruelty. There was hope in that. Maybe not for Vance, but for Jesse. There was definitely hope. The truck's headlights illuminated a sign, "Welcome to California." He'd be in Los Angeles by morning. Back to the life he'd built. The career that had made him a household name. But he wouldn't forget this. He never did. Some men spent their lives proving they were tough, throwing their weight around, demanding respect through fear. Clint had learned long ago that real strength didn't need to prove anything. It simply existed, quiet and certain, until the moment it was needed. And when that moment came, real strength didn't gloat. It didn't celebrate. It just did what needed doing, then walked away. The desert gave way to mountains, then valleys, then the sprawling lights of civilization. Clint drove through it all, a solitary figure in an old truck, carrying lessons that couldn't be taught, only learned through living. 6 months later, Jesse stood in the garage bay at Thompson Auto Repair in Cottonwood Springs, his hands stained with grease, his back sore from a long day's work. But it was honest work, good work. He'd learned more in half a year about engines and transmissions than he'd learned in years of riding with the Scorpions. Tommy Thompson, Donna's brother, walked past and clapped him on the shoulder. "Nice job on that transmission. Kid, you got good hands." Jesse smiled. "Thank you, sir." He cleaned up, washed his hands, and clocked out. His motorcycle, the only thing he'd kept from his old life, sat in the parking lot. He'd repainted it, removing the Scorpions logo, turning it from a symbol of intimidation into just a means of transportation. As he rode home to his small apartment, he passed the roadside diner. Through the window, he could see Donna serving customers, smiling, the place feeling safe again. Jesse had heard through the grapevine that Vance had been sentenced to 4 years in state prison. He'd be eligible for parole in 2 if he behaved. Word was he'd been quiet inside, keeping to himself, working in the prison library. Maybe he was changing too. Maybe not. Either way, it was his path to walk. Jesse pulled into his apartment complex and killed the engine. As he climbed the stairs to his unit, he thought about that night at the motel, about Clint Eastwood's words, "Don't waste your life following fools." He hadn't, and he wouldn't. Somewhere out there, Clint Eastwood continued his life. Some said he was filming a new movie. Others claimed they'd seen him in Montana, or Texas, or Mexico. The stories varied, growing with each telling, until it was hard to separate fact from legend. But for the people of that small Arizona town, the truth was simpler. A man had come through, stood up to bullies when no one else would, and left without asking for anything in return. He'd shown them that age was just a number, that courage wasn't about size or noise, and that sometimes the quietest man in the room was the most dangerous. And for Jesse and a few others, he'd shown them something even more valuable, that it was never too late to choose a different path. The diner still served coffee and pie. The motel still flickered its neon sign into the desert night. Life went on, as it always did. But the people remembered. They told their children and their grandchildren about the night Clint Eastwood came to town. Not because of the fight, though that was part of it, but because of what he represented. That strength without wisdom, was just violence. That power without restraint was just cruelty. And that the true measure of a man wasn't how many people feared him, but how many people he protected. On a quiet highway somewhere in the American West, an old Ford truck rolled through the darkness. At the wheel sat a man who'd been many things: actor, fighter, icon. But underneath all the roles and all the legends, he was simply a man who understood one fundamental truth. Legends aren't made in Hollywood. They're made in moments like these, in dusty diners and desert parking lots, in choices made when no one's watching and everything's on the line, in knowing when to fight and when to walk away, in understanding that the real victory isn't defeating your enemy, but in giving him a chance to become something better. The truck disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind only tire tracks in the dust and a story that would be told for generations. And somewhere in that story, buried beneath the action and the drama, was a simple lesson that echoed long after the last word was spoken. True strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to show mercy, not in the ability to win every fight, but in choosing which fights matter, not in standing over defeated enemies, but in offering them a path to redemption. Clint Eastwood had given that gift to Vance and Jesse both. What they did with it was up to them, but the opportunity existed, and that was enough. The highway stretched on, endless and patient, waiting for the next traveler with a story to tell. And, in a small Arizona town, life continued, forever changed by a man who'd simply done what needed doing, then quietly disappeared into the night. Some called him a hero, others called him a legend. Clint would have called himself neither. He was just a man who understood that sometimes the greatest battles aren't won with fists, they're won with choices.